Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast from Iowa's leading agricultural news source. Brought to you by the Iowa Farm Bureau. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to the May 18th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast, which is also the finale of Iowa Farm Bureau's special 3-part series on managing farm stress in the midst of COVID-19. I'm Delaney Howell, and if you find yourself dealing with a lot more stress than usual these days, I know I certainly do, I think you're really going to appreciate hearing from Dr. Larry Tranel, a pastoral psychologist and dairy specialist for Iowa State Extension, who has spent more than 30 years working with farm families. We've heard some great advice from Dr. Tranel so far in parts 1 and 2 of this series. If you haven't listened to those already, I definitely encourage you to stop here and check them out in your favorite podcast app or head to iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. Today, we feature part 3 of Dr. Tranel's interview with Farm Bureau's very own Caitlin Lamb, which is all about managing stress as a family. Let's hand it over to Caitlin for that discussion.
So if you listen to the previous 2 segments, you know we've talked about recognizing stress, some specific stress coping skills, and how to relay stress to your farm business team and long-term business planning. Now we're going to discuss stress and its impact on family life. And let me tell you, Larry, I have been looking forward to this segment. I've been working from home for about a month and a half, and for just about all of that time, my husband's either been hauling grain or in the middle of spring planting, meaning I'm more or less single parenting a very active toddler with no opportunity for outside help since we are quarantined. There have been days where I'm like, okay, I got this. I've made all the healthy meals. I've kept screen time to under an hour. I've got an educational activity plan to work out in, got my, work done. And other days where I'm like praying, please God, please give me the strength to make it through today. I just need to get through today. My kid can have all the goldfish he wants and watch all the tractor videos on YouTube that he wants. And I know I'm not alone on that. And I especially feel for the farm wives and the farm women who have school-age kids, because now they've taken on this educator role on top of all the other roles that they're trying to balance. So how can adults, especially those farm wives and farm women in the home, help maintain a positive environment and not take out some of those frustrations on others in the household?
Yeah, I think you set the stage extremely well, because we realize that women are putting more effort into these farms. They've got bigger roles to play with it, not just this, that, or the other thing, but they're actually managing more, doing a lot of field work, managing the books, sometimes coupled with those traditional roles of the kids, the household, and a lot of community leadership as well. And now we put this additional stress on top of it, as you mentioned. And so now we've got all these other things that just suddenly came on our plate. Plus, they got to practice social distance, which is very difficult for a lot of women. It's supposed to be funny. Okay, how do you plan out the daily schoolwork, make a meal trip, and you limit the trips to the store? You got to start wearing a mask, run these errands, and feel like everything that we touch is contaminated. Or now we got to teach a family member to zip on a Zoom call to see them, make sure they're okay. And this list can go on and on of what's happened. So we take a look at a lot of farm women that were actually already heavy stressed with a lot of roles that they were supposed to be playing. And now on top of this, they're going to be homeschooling their kids and doing this, that, or the other thing as well. And so the world is, in a sense, kind of flipped upside down for them. So one of the things I like to say is just take time to appreciate the simple things in life, because now we actually have the benefit of spending more time with our children, or maybe more time with our spouse if we were working off the farm and now we're working remotely from home. And so there's a lot of things that actually can become a benefit here if we just take the time and smell the roses. But seems like our U.S. life has gotten so busy, and so one of the things that they call us human beings, But I think we're more endurers. We always got to be doing something versus sitting back and just kind of sometimes being and appreciating those simple things in life. When, especially going back to the time when life was a little bit more simpler and we didn't have that cell phone and we didn't have this, that, or the other thing to always be running to. And how do we actually learn to appreciate the fact that these things are coming, working with us? So simple things like when it's nice out, I mean, just to take the time to think about, doesn't it feel great just to be outside in the sunshine or watching the birds or seeing the green grass come and things like that. So we also have a lot of family projects that we've got. I know our family has done a lot more cooking together, finding different types of things, different types of recipes. And, if we would always just be going to a restaurant or whatever, a lot of times this thing is getting lost. But again, how can we focus on that family time? I think for a lot of people, just to really look how we can appreciate it. But when I take a look at a lot of the stress, a lot of the farm women, a colleague of mine, Jen Bentley, has this Dairy Girl acronym. The D stands for deep breathe, as we talked about in the previous segment. How do we stay active with our own goals and making sure that we're exercising? And how do we implement the change? And hopefully those changes are pretty positive ones. And to remember your team, because we have this social network, hopefully, or this family network, and how do we remember who they are and why we're actually here and what our purpose is as wife, as mother, as friend, as community leader, whatever. And I think as we take a look at the gratitude that we have for life itself, how do we use that gratitude to increase our own happiness, restore our body, mind, and soul, and just to continue to learn? Because as these kids learn, and I just think of some of the homework, it was about probably when some of my kids were in about the 5th grade is when I started throwing up my arms and says, I can't help you with this. A little more complicated than I'm used to. But I think there's a lot of things we just need to sit back and actually learn to appreciate and help kids and talk meaning to them about what this means and what that means, because we just so often in this culture just pass over things just because we got to get it done. We don't take the time with family members to talk about this, the meaning of it, the definition, the reality of it, how this relates to something else, the respect we need to have, whether it be for nature or for this person or whatever, and just really talk in their time and kind of talk their walk.
When it comes to our spouses, we're all carrying varying loads of work. And whether we like it or not, I feel like sometimes resentment can kind of creep into our relationships. Yes, I understand you had a rough day. The tractor broke down. The dealer has to order parts in. You didn't eat all day because there's one thing after another. But, can't you see that I'm cleaning up an absolute tornado of a house because the kids were, wild animals. And I can't figure out, like you said, schoolwork is getting complicated and now they don't carry the 1 in math anymore. And there's all this Common Core stuff that I don't get. And so, especially, you mentioned women have more of a role on the farm than ever before. And there's so much going on. But, what strategies can we use to avoid, resentment or just when we're just tired, we just don't have the motivation and neither spouse really feels at 100%. How can we give our kids and our spouse our best when we don't really feel our best?
Yeah, Caitlin, I guess one of the things I would first say is, how do you embrace this crisis? We learn to be strong because we go through different types of things like this. Let the crisis teach us about ourselves. There's one thing that we always said about, nobody's ever going to teach you more about yourself or more than you ever want to know than your spouse. Okay, in good times and in bad. And so as we take a look at the crisis that we're in, is that we're not going to be the same person after that as we were before. But we're going to choose, are we going to be stronger or weaker after this? And I think as spouses try to relate to each other, it's not just they embrace each other, but they embrace the crisis and continually remind each other that we're going to get through this. Often we start playing victim, or we start playing the blame game in these relationships as well. And so we realize that, things are going to happen. We're busy. We make mistakes. And we also realize that an unforgiving spirit actually takes a lot of energy out of us. And so anytime, as you mentioned that word resentment, so this person did this, we start resenting it. It takes a lot of our energy for us to actually try to think through that process of why they do this or why didn't they do that. Okay, did they understand how this affected me? And so we need to actually refuse to be that victim, and we need to refuse to play that blame game as we work with it. I think a third thing that kind of creeps up in these relationships during the stress is that we have a hard time accepting our emotions. I mentioned before that sometimes we have a hard time identifying them. And even if we do identify them, I think it's even sometimes more difficult to accept what we've identified and try to figure out through that. So what do? We lay in bed at night with our chest pounding or our mind racing, thoughts of anger, failure, guilt, shame, all these things that you mentioned, and even death might surface during that time. So we don't want to deny those thoughts, but we need to accept those thoughts as part of whether a grieving process or a learning process to work with it and actually realize that those thoughts are actually pretty normal. They are who you are. And living with our emotions is painful, but it helps us build resolve to persevere, to build that resiliency over time. And so it's important for us to deal with those emotions. We also need to make sure we continue to connect with each other. And so now what do? We have these families that are hunkered down at home by themselves. And so back in the day, not a big deal, but we've become so trained with whether it be our telephones or, connecting with people, that it's harder for us to actually connect. And so when we take a look at this, and I know men tend to be not as great at communicators as what women tend to be, they tend to be less verbal. And so when we take a look at how do we try to keep that in an era of social distancing, still have some social connection, because it's pretty important for us to reach out and keep us connected to the world and to other people. Another thing that I kind of mention is that, in times of crisis like this, people often turn quite negative. And we can't really avoid negative people, but how do you try to not let their negativity come back to us? Okay, so when we take a look at positive emotions, they're pretty catchy, but so are negative emotions as well. And so nothing that really crashes us down faster than people with negative thoughts. And research on stress and crisis, as with health issues, so that people with positive attitudes, they tend to handle and they tend to recover from crises better than those with negative attitudes. It's part of the resilience training that we have. So how do we keep our sense of humor? How do we force ourselves sometimes to smile? You mentioned a couple of times, just as you take a look at some of the feelings you've had about being a spouse, maybe not being good enough or this or that or the other thing. But how do we keep that sense of humor alive, force ourselves to smile? In my own life, I know in the past 2-3 weeks, I've had to find stuff to smile about and force myself to smile. And again, it's a mindset tactic, even if I have to look in the mirror and just kind of laugh at myself a little bit. But it gets those serotonin levels, that happiness index, a little bit. And it seems like once we kind of dig ourselves out of that little hole that we have a hard time smiling, and break that barrier with a smile, okay, it's a little easier for us to feel a little happier when we meet the next person or deal with it. So there's a lot of people being shut out right now. Okay, so a lot of this stress, what do? We shut people out of our lives. Okay, definitely not the best resiliency strategy, taking care of ourselves. And so maybe I'm a little culprit at this, but men that tend not to shave near as much, or we spend the day working in our pajamas. I know farmers are going to be like this, but sometimes we're not taking care of ourselves quite as much as we were before this pandemic hit. And then I think one of the last things is just, how do you believe in tomorrow? Okay, is there a reason this crisis is happening? You take a look at people of faith. Research shows that people with a prayer life, with a faith life, tend to actually become more resilient in understanding and dealing with their problems over time. And so that's one thing we just kind of, what do we believe in? Believe in yourself, believe in a higher being. I'm not saying that from an extension perspective, but I'm saying that from the part of research that shows that people believe in something bigger than themselves tend to become more resilient. So take the bull by the horns, and I think that's just a strategy for all of us to be resourceful, to be resilient, and do it for yourself as well.
Okay, a lot of great thoughts there, Larry. And I know that, as we've said, you and I are both people of faith. And I mentioned when I was having that bad day, I say a little prayer. I just need a little strength to get through today and tomorrow. And I can just say from a personal perspective, that helps me. So I appreciate you bringing that to the table. And I want to switch gears here to talk specifically about our kids. So I think sometimes it seems, especially with maybe older kids who have more of an understanding, they see mom and dad are tackling their own struggles or challenges. Maybe they don't want to bother them with, whatever they're personally thinking or feeling. So what types of signs are there that children may be experiencing stress, and how can parents help their kids adopt stress management strategies?
Okay, so one of the early signs would be, when they have trouble like focusing in school, but they're not in school now. But if they have trouble focusing just on their schoolwork, this, that, or the other thing, I think that's always a mindset one. When they start having emotional outbursts, not listening, kind of a rebellious type thing. I mean, most teenagers in that 14 to 17 year time frame, they tend to be a little on the rebellious side too. And sometimes I'd be more concerned if they didn't rebel at me as a parent during that time frame, just because that's how they're growing. They're becoming more of an individual and less dependent on themselves. And so it's actually a tactic that they need to go through, is actually to rebel against their parents in a sense there. I think when we take a look at kids, parents need to make sure that they're taking care of themselves first, because just like if you're on the airline and the mask drops, they always tell you to put your mask on first so you can better help your kid. It's the same thing. You need to take care of your own sleep, your own eating habits, your exercise, and be healthy and fit yourself. And then it's a lot easier for you to actually help your kids. But we realize that well-adjusted youth, they tend to come from well-adjusted parents. And so modeling healthy behavior is definitely the key. So when kids witness unhealthy conflict due to farm or family, they always tend to think, sometimes it's they kind of stay in their mind forever when they witness, say, a parent fighting. And so we realize that kids tend to magnify a lot of issues, where they make it a lot bigger than it is. So even though it's a small thing, mom and dad just got in an argument, and they magnify it. Well, it looks like they're getting a divorce. Okay, so how do you magnify? They also internalize a lot of things, is that when something happens, whether it be something very external to them, like it might be the farm might be leaving the family, so they might internalize this, or mom and dad might be getting a divorce. They internalize it, well, it's all my fault. Okay, so they definitely make things bigger than they are, and they tend to internalize, and think we need to recognize that as parents, that they tend to work with that. So you can cause them to be anxious, scared, sleepless nights. And again, they're going to respond by either acting out or turning inward, or they have trouble interacting and dealing with their own relationships, or concentrating, performing in school or elsewhere. So we realize that all families have conflict, or they're not normal. Okay, so I come from a normal family. My kids are growing up in a normal family. That tends to be part of the picture. So to try to get away from conflict is not actually a healthy thing. In fact, when we work with marriage counseling, we actually encourage. Sometimes we'll say couples that never argue tend not to grow together very well either. Okay, so arguments, challenging each other, sometimes even conflict or whatever, helps us grow as people and helps relationships grow as well.
When you talk about the need to rebel against parents, I just internally shudder. Our toddler hasn't quite hit that terrible 2 phase yet, but we've definitely, experienced some legit meltdowns. And I'm not a perfect mom by any means, and I think I'm really honest about that. But one thing that I am proud of is when our toddler Ryan starts fussing, my husband and I will say, hey buddy, can you take a deep breath? And he stops, and he does. He takes a deep inhale and blows it out almost so exaggeratively that you have to try not to laugh. But, he's young, and I know he's probably not going to have a lot of memories from this time, and we can't explain to him necessarily what's happening in the world, and why he has to talk to Gaga through the window, or why he can't hug Papa. But with those older kids, how do we communicate what we're dealing with, particularly maybe if it's a financial issue, and do we protect them from bad news and potential changes, or what level of honesty is appropriate?
So I would say what level of honesty is appropriate is that I would never encourage anybody to lie to their children. Okay, so honesty is always the number one thing, because kids, when they pick up that, well, mom and dad didn't tell us the truth, so they don't trust you in this thing, that. So we might not tell them all the truth. And so based on age-appropriate levels of what they can understand, I would tend to encourage us to share with them what's going on, that, we've got some financial difficulty on the farm for the older kids, for the younger kids, there's just, things just aren't working quite as well out. We can't afford to do this or we can't afford to do that. Hopefully at some point we can, but just in a very age-appropriate manner. I think it's important for us to tell them the truth about what's going on, because kids will figure it out. Even if we don't tell them, they know something's going on. So they're very intuitive, I think, in that way. So when we take a look at communicating with these kids under stress, I always think that there's what I call kind of a talk plan. So we've got a talk meaning. So how do you teach kids to see and appreciate the meaning of even small good things in their life, starting at an early age? Okay, they tend to find greater happiness and satisfaction even amidst difficulty, and it helps them understand the bigger picture and the bigger meaning of life as they get older. So don't be afraid to talk with those young kids about just the meaning of this, that, or the other thing, especially in nature, the family values, the faith values, and things like that. I think it's important for us to talk definition, is that help youth define who they are and their strengths and their abilities, not just on athletic talents or musical talents, for example, but how do you call attention to their goodness, their kindness, their sensitivity. So it's those virtues in life, not their athletic skill or whatever, that I think we really need to talk definition with the kids. And how do you try to encourage them daily while it's still today with positive points, and maybe mention 5 or 10 positive points for every negative point you work with. I think we also need to talk positive reality that help youth realize that if they want to feel good about themselves, that they seriously need to think good about themselves. So new age parenting, it just seems like we don't want our kids to feel sorry for themselves or feel bad about this, that, or the other thing. Personally, I think it's a totally wrong approach, is that we need to help kids think good about themselves if you want them to feel good about themselves. Okay, so we need to worry more about their thought process than we do about their feelings. And if we can help them empathize with what they're going through feeling-wise and help them think through it, again, focusing more on the thoughts and the feelings, I think we're going to have a kid that's better resilient to deal with what comes in life. Okay, so humility and confidence, I think, are two things that we sometimes fail as a society to teach our kids. Okay, we teach them to have a lot of pride in themselves, which sometimes can actually work against us, versus knowing what that virtue of humility is. We also want to make sure they talk relative and not magnify their problems. So our farm youth don't always have everything everybody else does, but I like to take my kids into foreign cultures and let them see what poverty truly looks like. And it helps them truly understand and maybe better appreciate the things that they have in the life that they have here. So it's a relative thing, and how do you talk relativity to these kids about why this is more important than that or whatever. Respect, because when kids get under stress, they tend to have less respect for teachers, parents, this, that, or the other thing. And so I always think that we need to model that in our own life. And even as we go through conflicts as husband, wife, or neighbor to neighbor, or whatever, it's just how do you model healthy ways to try to deal with life's problems? And I think that's pretty important. And when people talk about different things that they work with, people talk about a lot of negative things. How do you focus on talking about joy with your kids and help them experience joy in their relationships by just being appreciative, by being joyful yourself, looking at the blessings even in sorrow, joking around as appropriate, and even being affectionate and empathetic, which having that tender touch as you work with people. So I think there's a lot of things like that we can work with to help kids manage their stress themselves. If I was kind of sum it up, I think with kids is that sometimes we fail just to talk at their level, because we realize that adults can be quite intimidating to youth, and not so much just because we're taller or whatever, but height is actually associated with power. So even sitting or kneeling or just getting closer to their level can help or improve our communication or eye-to-eye contact. And how do you try to talk in their time? Because we realize that youth are not as talkative when their minds are occupied someplace else, like meal times and car rides, or family game time, or just one of my favorite parts is just lying in bed at night, putting the kids to bed, and just that little prayer time. Because if you really want them to focus on things that are important, the last things that they talk about or think about before they fall to sleep, to kind of get that into their subconscious and work with things. We also kind of talk in their talk using word pictures, things that they can understand, because a lot of times we're using a language that might be above them. But I just think when we take a look at keeping the fundamentals of parenting, which you got to keep the fun in it, but you also got to keep the mentals part of it, that thought process, and help them think through different types of things. So I would just tend to say that it's important for us to just deal with the kids and their stress and help them understand it, tell them things in a very age-appropriate way, but definitely tell them and be honest to them.
Larry, thank you so much for joining us with this stress management series. We've talked about dealing with stress within ourselves, our family farms, as a business, our family units. We're in some difficult times that you also acknowledge have opportunity for growth and resiliency. So how do you see things, coming out on the other side? Where can we positively go from here? And if we need more assistance, where can we turn?
Okay, so there's a lot of things. I think one of the biggest things that people under stress, and they kind of wallow in their own problems, even become more stressed. And so the people that have become most resilient to a lot of stress are the people that do things for others, and they worry about other people's problems sometimes more than their own, whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. But people that are other-minded tend to be. So that's one thing I encourage people to do is, it's easy to look at our own problems, but I suspect we probably have a lot better than a lot of people in this lot of life. When we take a look at some of the resources that might be available, you can always give us a call. With Extension, there's a lot of organizations that have people that work in different areas, whether it be as consultants with mental health and things like that. I would like to mention again the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. And in addition to that, they also have a QPR training that you can actually contact Extension and actually try to sign up and actually be kind of certify yourself to be actually trained over. It's only about an hour training, but just I thought it was very valuable, even myself, to be trained in trying to work with people through suicide. You can also reach the Iowa Concern Hotline, which is another 1-800 number, open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's 800-447-1985. We also have a Dairy Team Farm Stress resource page that if you just Google or do an internet search on Extension Dairy Team, ISU Extension Dairy Team Farm Stress, that internet site will actually come up. And so the bottom line of all this, I guess I would tend to say, is stay proactive about it. Okay, so people that are reactive or have this victim mentality or that everything is beyond my control tend to not handle the stress very well, and they tend to lose hope. So no matter how bad life gets, we still have a lot of freedom to control our attitudes and control our responses and even our actions, even amidst these very challenging times. So again, find things to smile about. Take a look at, time to stretch, exercise, just simply breathe, extend yourself to others. Try to just be aware of how others in the neighborhood are coping as well, because like I said, it's easy for us to wallow in our own stress and grief and not realizing that our problems might pale in comparison to our neighbors or others who are near or far from us. And we also realize that life itself is pretty relative, so learning about self through others, realizing we might have it a lot better than we thought.
We'd like to thank Dr. Tranel for sharing his extensive knowledge with us over the course of this 3-part podcast series on managing farm stress. I think it's really helpful to hear from someone who just gets the stress that farm families are facing right now. And I think we can all agree that Dr. Tranel, with his 30-plus years of experience working with farmers, really understands the obstacles that rural America is facing right now. Again, if you'd like to go back and listen to this entire 3-part series on managing farm stress in the midst of COVID-19, just subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in your favorite podcasting app or go to iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. And if you'd like even more information and resources on coping with stress, including the free and confidential hotlines that Dr. Tranel mentioned, head out to iowafarmbureau.com/farmstress. That's it for this episode of the Spokesman Speaks. I'm Delaney Howell, and if you enjoyed this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and join us for the next regularly scheduled episode on June 1st. Until next time, I hope that you stay safe, protect your loved ones, and find new ways of responding to the challenges of feeding our neighbors in Iowa and all around the globe. Thanks for reading The Spokesman, and thanks for listening to The Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to The Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcasts and articles from The Spokesman at iowafarmbureau.com/spokesman. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Play, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews and welcome your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.